Before the world was measured, it was imagined. The ancients looked out across an endless horizon and saw not water, not distance, but a living mystery breathing just beyond sight. The earth had no borders, no names, no straight lines. It was an untamed body, clothed in fog, watched by stars that seemed to whisper routes only gods could follow. Long before compasses or coordinates, humanity's first act of discovery was not to travel, but to dream of direction. The earliest maps were not tools, they were prayers in clay and ink. In ancient Babylon, a scribe pressed symbols into wet earth, carving the known world as a circle surrounded by an ocean of death. He called it the Bitter River. Around that edge, he marked places where monsters waited. Each mark was a warning, but also a promise, that the edge of fear could be drawn, named, and thus survived. For the Babylonians, to map the world was to build a wall against the infinite. Beyond it lay chaos, the great silence that swallowed the careless. Far across the seas, Polynesian navigators charted the waves without paper, using memory as their map. They stretched palm ribs and shells into patterns that mimicked the swell of the ocean, learning how islands revealed themselves through the language of currents. Their charts were alive, bending and creaking like the waves they described. Theirs was not a geography of distance, but of rhythm, a heartbeat of water and wind that guided canoes through black horizons. No stars were fixed, no paths were certain. Their maps were not lies, but living conversations with the sea. In China, scholars traced heaven onto earth. The emperor's cartographers shaped their empire as a mirror of the cosmos, each city placed according to celestial order. To walk through the empire was to walk through a reflection of the sky. The map was not a representation, it was a spell of harmony, a proof that the world below obeyed the same invisible rules as the heavens above. And if that was true, then rebellion was not only political, it was cosmic. Even in their beauty, these maps hid a quiet intention. They told people where the sacred ended and the forbidden began. A map could teach reverence, but it could also teach obedience. When priests drew the earth as a flat disk crowned by paradise, they were not describing the world, they were enforcing a story. In their diagrams, geography and theology merged until they became indistinguishable. The sea's edge was not a question of distance, it was a moral boundary. To cross it was to challenge God himself. Perhaps that was always the secret purpose of the map, not to describe reality, but to command it. To draw a line is to separate one truth from another. And so, long before maps measured the planet, they measured belief. Each culture wrapped its fears in parchment and called it understanding. Each line drawn across the unknown turned chaos into meaning, and meaning into power. Yet, even in their errors, those early visions carried a strange tenderness. The monsters painted in the margins, serpents, winged men, islands that devoured ships, were not decorations. They were acknowledgements that the world could never be fully known. The ancients understood something we have forgotten. That mystery too deserves space. Their maps left room for wonder. Over time, the ink spread, and the blankness shrank. But in this first age, when the earth still breathed in myth, maps were living things. They were neither right nor wrong. They were bridges between terror and faith, between what was seen and what could be imagined. In those faint lines pressed into clay or inked on vellum, humanity learned to create order by pretending to know. And perhaps that was the beginning of civilization, not walls, not kings, but the comforting illusion that the world could be contained within the boundaries of a drawing. Somewhere, in the hush of an ancient library, a monk dips his quill into ink. He traces a coastline he has never seen, guided by rumor and reverence. The candlelight trembles. Outside, the sea still roars, wild and indifferent. Inside, a single line spreads across the page, transforming chaos into certainty. He does not know it yet, but what he has drawn will one day decide where nations begin and where others are erased. Soon, these lines will no longer protect, they will divide. And the world, once blank and breathing, will learn what it means to be owned. The world was once small enough to fit inside a circle. In medieval Europe, map makers called their creations TO maps. Simple diagrams dividing the earth into three parts: Asia above, Europe to one side, and Africa to the other, all encircled by the great O of the ocean. At the very center stood Jerusalem, the navel of creation, glowing like the heart of divine order. To the medieval mind, this was not geography, it was theology. The world had meaning because it mirrored heaven. Every mountain, every sea, every kingdom had its place in the great hierarchy of God's design. But what these maps revealed most clearly was not the world, it was the mind that drew them. The TO map, elegant and serene, showed not continents, but convictions. It was less a record of distance than of devotion, a confession inked in colour and faith. The cartographer's quill was guided as much by scripture as by compass, and in the soft gold light of monastic libraries, the earth became a prayer written in circles. Those who studied such maps believed they were reading divine architecture. The shape of the world, they thought, was not for discovery, but for contemplation. Paradise lay to the east, always the east where the light first touched creation. To travel eastward was to seek salvation. To sail beyond that edge, where monsters and pagans dwelled, was to risk not only one's life, but one's soul. The border between known and unknown was drawn in ink, but it felt eternal. The medieval imagination loved symmetry. It believed the world was not vast, but complete, a closed garden rather than an open wilderness. And yet, even within this perfect geometry, shadows lingered. Entire peoples disappeared from the page, erased by theology's quiet hand. The blank spaces on these maps were not accidents of ignorance, they were moral exclusions. What was not Christian was not counted. The unknown was not a question, it was a judgment. In those centuries, maps were sermons. Their delicate lines carried warnings disguised as wonder. Here be dragons was not simply superstition, it was a boundary of faith. It marked where God's image ended and chaos began. And in those dark edges, humanity projected its fears. Skin darkened by the sun became sin, distance became corruption, strangeness became proof of otherness. Geography was turned into morality, and morality into control. While Europe inked its circles, across the seas, other civilizations were drawing different heavens upon the same earth. In India, Hindu cosmology envisioned the universe as a series of concentric realms, vast mandalas spiraling outward from Mount Meru, the sacred mountain at the center of all existence. Each ring of land and sea was both a physical and spiritual space, blending geometry with divinity. The map was not a tool of possession but of meditation, a way to visualize eternity. These mandalas were less about where one stood and more about what one was. Every human, every creature, every god occupied a layer of the same cosmic order. To understand the world was to understand the self's place within it. But even in their grace, these cosmic maps shared one secret with Europe's circles. They too made choices. They arranged reality according to faith, not observation. The unknown was not beyond the map, it was beneath it, hidden within the cycles of rebirth and illusion. Further west, in the Islamic Golden Age, maps reached a different kind of magnificence. Arab scholars like al-Idrisi redrew the earth with a precision that stunned later centuries. His great silver map, engraved for the Norman king Roger II in the 12th century, showed a world both measured and sacred. Unlike European maps, it placed south at the top, a quiet rebellion against inherited perspective. To look upon it was to feel the humility of knowledge, that every orientation is a choice, and every choice hides a bias. In the libraries of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, mapmakers worked not for kings but for understanding. They studied stars, trade winds, and the reports of travelers. Yet even their maps shimmered with symbolism. Each continent, each river, each city bore traces of divine geometry. The Kaaba stood as the spiritual axis, the point toward which the faithful turned in prayer, the invisible pole of a world united by belief. Their maps were more honest than Europe's, but still they bowed to meaning over fact. It is tempting to think that ancient maps were naive, products of limited knowledge, but in truth, they were deliberate. They were instruments of worldview, crafted to confirm the order their societies depended upon. To hold such a map was to hold reassurance that the universe was known, that every soul had its place, that chaos waited outside the frame. Each map was a spell of containment, a promise that the infinite could be explained with ink. The beauty of those maps distracts us from their violence. Illuminated with lapis and gold, they look like acts of devotion, but beauty is often the disguise of control. Within their ornamented frames, humanity divided itself. Those at the center were sanctified, those at the edges were forgotten. A world drawn in faith left little room for those who lived beyond its doctrine. The uncharted was not empty, it was silenced. Even now, looking at these ancient relics, one feels their quiet arrogance. The shimmering blues of divine oceans, the delicate reds tracing holy lands all whisper the same message. We know what the world should be. Each map became a mirror polished by power, reflecting not landscapes but hierarchies. Those who held the pen held the right to define existence, and the map, like all mirrors, could flatter or erase. Yet there is a strange tenderness in their ignorance. They believed that to draw the world was to understand it, that truth could be shaped by patience and pigment. They sought to reconcile heaven and earth, to find divine meaning in geography. Their mistake was not belief, it was certainty. Theirs was a world too perfect to breathe. Still, something stirs beneath the gold leaf and faded ink. In every circle of paradise, in every dragon curled at the edge of the sea, there lingers a human longing to know where we are, to place ourselves inside a pattern that makes sense. Perhaps that longing was the first real map, drawn not on paper but in the mind, a compass of hope pointing toward meaning. As the centuries turned, those sacred maps began to crack. Pilgrims returned with tales that didn't fit the pattern. New stars appeared. Strange coastlines whispered through rumor and trade. The more the world was seen, the less it obeyed belief. Slowly, faith's geometry unraveled. The edges grew restless again. A monk sits at his desk, staring at his circle of creation. His candle burns low, dripping wax across the parchment. He has heard stories of islands beyond the horizon, of lands untouched by his God. He hesitates, quill in hand, torn between obedience and curiosity. At last, he draws a line beyond the border. It is faint, trembling, but it changes everything. For the first time, a mapmaker dares to imagine the world not as it should be, but as it might be. And with that simple act, the circle begins to open. The myth gives way to motion. The sea roars beyond the parchment, calling the next age to rise. The world changed the moment paper learned to dream. By the dawn of the Renaissance, ink had become a weapon, and maps once prayers were now plans. The printing press whispered its revolution through Europe, spreading not faith, but replication. The earth, which had once belonged to gods and myths, now belonged to men who dared to measure it. For the first time, the globe could be held in one's hands, folded, annotated, and sold. The age of discovery was not born at sea, it began on desks. Before the sails filled with wind, the quills filled with purpose. Ptolemy's ghost returned from antiquity, his ancient Geographia resurrected from dusty manuscripts. His grids, drawn centuries before compass needles found north, offered explorers something sacred, the illusion of precision. Kings and scholars clutched those reprinted maps as if they contained prophecy. Yet even then, the outlines were wrong. Continents drifted where they did not exist, seas collided where land should be. Still, no one cared for accuracy, only authority. In Antwerp, a man named Abraham Ortelius began to weave these illusions into a single tapestry. His Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, Theatre of the World, was less an atlas than a manifesto. To open its pages was to witness the performance of empire. Each map was a stage upon which kingdoms expanded, rivers shifted, and myths were replaced by measurements. But the beauty of Ortelius's work was its seduction. The maps gleamed with elegance, hand-coloured oceans of pale blue, mountains etched like veins beneath the skin of the earth. Readers did not see conquest. They saw harmony. They mistook domination for design. A generation later, Gerardus Mercator gave the world its most enduring lie. His projection, the mathematical flattening of a sphere onto paper, reshaped how the world imagined itself. In his geometry, Europe swelled, Greenland loomed, and Africa diminished into manageable scale. It was not deliberate cruelty, it was convenience. But convenience, in the hands of power, becomes destiny. Mercator's lines would come to justify centuries of imbalance, for they placed the old world at the center, stable, enlarged, eternal. The new world became peripheral, fragile, waiting to be named. The map had become a language, one that rulers spoke fluently. Kings no longer needed to cross oceans to claim them. A single inked boundary could transform rumor into ownership. Explorers in turn carried maps like weapons. When they landed on new shores, they did not plant their flag first, they unfolded parchment. They showed the land to its own inhabitants and declared, "You are already here." The paper had arrived before the men had. In this new world of ink and authority, every coastline became a declaration, every river a signature. The cartographer's art was precision, but its heart was politics. A misplaced line could start a war. An erased island could erase a people. Behind every expedition, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, there stood a room filled with draftsmen and surveyors, their eyes tracing borders across a planet they had never touched. It was empire, by geometry. The Renaissance had promised knowledge, and it delivered, but not without cost. For every new discovery, a silence followed. The more the world was drawn, the more it was divided. Maps turned the unknown into property, and the infinite into possession. A sea was no longer a mystery, it was a route. A forest was no longer sacred, it was a resource. To map was to own. And yet, the mapmakers believed they were serving truth. Their tools, compass, astrolabe, quadrant, seemed instruments of divine order. They were, after all, bringing light to the darkness. But truth, when caged in lines, begins to deform. The more they described the earth, the further they drifted from it. A world once fluid and alive became a network of coordinates, a grid of control. In the quiet workshops of Venice and Nuremberg, men bent over parchment as if in prayer. The smell of ink mingled with wax and sea salt. Each stroke of the quill was both discovery and desecration. Some maps were adorned with angels blowing winds from the corners of the earth. Others bore sea monsters half faded by time. These embellishments were not mistakes. They were the residue of fear, a reminder that even reason could not fully silence mystery. The monsters persisted, hiding not in the oceans now, but in the ambitions of those who held the maps. There is a strange poetry in how empire began not with thunder, but with paper. Ships would follow the ink, not the stars. The voyages of Columbus, Magellan, and Drake all began with the same ritual. A man standing before a map, imagining a line across the blue. That act of imagination, quiet, private, absolute, was the true moment of conquest. The sea only confirmed what the paper had already claimed. The people who lived on those distant shores had no say in their own existence. To appear on a European map was to be discovered. To vanish from it was to be erased. The cartographer's silence was more final than any army. You could resist a fleet, but you could not resist absence. Still, the mapmakers told themselves they were merely observers. They copied what explorers described, never asking whose eyes first saw it. Their lines were meant to record, not decide. But the world does not honor such innocence. Once a boundary is drawn, it begins to harden. Once a name is written, it begins to claim. By the late 16th century, the age of wonder had turned into the age of order. Maps filled with grids, compasses, and Latin notations. The blankness, that sacred space where imagination once lived, was shrinking fast. The unknown, once divine, became an error to be corrected. The earth was nearly whole, yet strangely smaller than ever. Humanity had traded mystery for mastery, and in doing so, had begun to measure itself. Still, there were moments when the illusion cracked. Some cartographers drew their maps from whispers, from second-hand voyages and sailors' tales. A misplaced island here, a phantom coast there, beautiful errors preserved in ink. They remind us that the map was never truth. It was belief with better tools. Beneath its accuracy, the same myth endured, that the world could be known, owned, and ordered. And perhaps that was the most dangerous idea of all. For once the world was drawn, someone would always come to claim it. The map was never merely an image, it was a command. It told ships where to sail, kings where to rule, and men where to die. Ink, not iron, built the first global empire. The world wasn't conquered by ships. It was conquered by drawings. And yet, even ink fades. Every empire redraws its truth until the map itself becomes a lie once more. Every age has its illusion, but few have been drawn so beautifully as those of the early mapmakers. Beneath the careful calligraphy and gilded coasts, the Renaissance world hid a quiet deception, a deliberate reshaping of reality to please the powerful and to feed the dreamers. For all their instruments and equations, cartographers remained storytellers at heart, and the stories they told, written in ink instead of words, built empires on the scaffolding of imagination. Take, for instance, the island of California, a legend that refused to die. For more than a century, European maps showed it floating freely, detached from the mainland, a crescent of paradise adrift in the Pacific. The idea began with a novel, a Spanish romance describing a mythical island ruled by warrior women and ruled by Queen Calafia, where the sands glittered with gold. Explorers carried this fiction across oceans until one day, a cartographer, perhaps eager to fill a blank space with wonder, drew it as fact. The ink hardened into belief. Kings funded expeditions, traders sailed in hope, and for generations, the world's most powerful nations planned their futures around a story that never existed. But California was not alone. The oceans of those centuries were crowded with ghosts, phantom islands, drawn from rumor, error, or ambition. There was High Brazil, the Isle of the Blessed, said to appear once every 7 years off the coast of Ireland, shimmering just beyond reach. Sailors swore they had seen it, a mirage of meadows and towers dissolving into fog. Mapmakers, too cautious to deny it, yet too enthralled to resist, etched it carefully onto their charts. Centuries later, when the Atlantic had been crossed and measured, High Brazil vanished, but not from the human mind. It simply changed names, reborn in myths of Atlantis, Antilia, El Dorado. To invent an island was to invent opportunity. A new shore meant new riches, new dominion, new glory for the crown that claimed it first. The empty spaces of the map were not voids, they were invitations. And so, the cartographer became a co-conspirator in empire, shaping the geography of greed. Some fictions were harmless, born of misread stars or distorted compass bearings. Others were crafted with purpose. A generous coastline might tempt investors. A smaller neighbor might calm disputes. Every inch of ink carried consequence. Behind the art of mapping lay a quieter economy, one of favor and survival. Mapmakers worked for patrons, and patrons desired power, not precision. A coastline too vague was an insult to ambition, a continent too empty, a missed chance. To secure a noble's trust and payment, one had to flatter their hopes. The map was a mirror, polished for those who paid to see their reflection enlarged. It was never only about truth, it was about persuasion. Even the greats played the game. Gerardus Mercator, master of geometry, filled his early globes with continents that never were. He drew Terra Australis, a vast southern land meant to balance the weight of the northern continents, not because he had seen it, but because symmetry demanded it. His imaginary Antarctica lured generations of explorers southward, men who perished chasing the harmony of his mathematics. To them, his fiction was not deceit, but destiny. There was beauty in the lies that was the danger. The phantom coasts, the elegant curves of continents that never existed, shimmered like promises. They offered a world larger than life, richer than reality. To believe in them was to believe that wonder still waited just beyond the edge. And so the lies multiplied, not from malice, but from longing. Humanity, newly freed from the old maps of faith, still needed something to worship. The blank spaces became its new altars. But deception, once drawn, acquires a life of its own. Consider the Sea of the West, a vast inland ocean that appeared on 18th century maps of North America. French cartographers, eager to claim discovery before Britain, invented it wholesale, a watery shortcut to Asia, a passage that might make France eternal. They published their maps, and suddenly the mirage became a national truth. Expeditions were launched, fortunes spent, lives lost to prove a sea that existed only in ink. When the truth emerged that the mountains were impassable, the sea imaginary, it was too late. The fiction had already served its purpose. It had justified the claim. This was the quiet genius of cartographic fraud. A lie told beautifully enough could shape reality. Once drawn, it guided ships, funded wars, and filled museums. When explorers failed to find the worlds they had been promised, they drew new ones instead. Discovery became invention by another name. Each map was a theatre, and the audience, kings, merchants, and dreamers alike demanded spectacle. And yet, the cartographers themselves were not villains. They lived in a world where uncertainty was intolerable. A blank space on the map was a reminder of human limitation, and limitation frightened those who ruled. Better to fill the void than face it. So the mapmakers filled it with fantasies, with fears, with possibilities too tempting to resist. Their forgeries were not crimes but comforts, made to soothe a species terrified of the unknown. Still, in the soft candlelight of their studies, some must have known what they were doing. They must have felt the tremor of conscience when their quills carved coastlines that no sailor had seen. They must have known that every stroke of ink tightened the leash of empire around lands that did not yet know they were owned. But power, rewards, belief, not honesty. A map that pleased the crown could outlive its maker, while the truth, like the uncharted sea, could drown in silence. What is remarkable is not that the world was misdrawn, but that so much of it remains so. Even today, the outlines we trust, the borders, the scales, the projections, are not neutral. Mercator's distortion still looms in classrooms and atlases, inflating the importance of some lands while diminishing others. The art of beautiful falsehood continues, only rendered now in pixels instead of parchment. Perhaps we never stopped lying about the world, we simply learned to lie better. The parchment fades. The candle burns low. A cartographer stares at the blank corner of his map, that last untouched space where the ocean bleeds into nothingness. He dips his quill, hesitates, and then writes the future. The ocean ripples as if it knows. And centuries later, satellites will orbit above that same place, tracing new coastlines, new illusions, each one more precise, more false, more complete. Did we ever stop lying? Or did we only change the tools? The quill of the missionary moved with the precision of prayer. In the 16th and 17th centuries, long before satellites and sensors, another form of divine surveillance began to take shape, one drawn not in secret, but in sanctity. Across the newly discovered continents, Jesuit missionaries spread not only faith, but coordinates. They arrived with crucifixes and compasses, Bibles and measuring rods. To them, salvation was not abstract. It had latitude and longitude. The world was to be converted not just in soul, but in space. The Jesuits were scholars before they were priests, mathematicians, astronomers, linguists, cartographers. Their maps were not merely guides for travel, but instruments for understanding the mind of God through the design of his creation. In their eyes, to chart a river was to trace divine intention. To name a mountain was to give order to the chaos of Eden reborn. Every village they mapped became a verse, every coastline, a psalm. They believed they were saving the world by drawing it. In the jungles of South America, in the deserts of China, in the islands of Japan, the Society of Jesus built invisible cathedrals of ink. From mission to mission, they collected data stars, plants, languages, customs, and sent them back to Europe. What began as devotion soon became a network. The Jesuit order, spread across 5 continents, created the first truly global information system. They shared maps, letters, and reports, compiling a portrait of the earth far more complete than any empire's archives. And while the kings ruled by decree, the Jesuits ruled by detail. They called it the ratio studiorum, the method a disciplined way of cataloguing knowledge as a form of worship. But within that devotion lay something else: control. To name was to claim. To describe was to define. A tribe recorded became a tribe converted. A forest mapped became a resource. In the name of salvation, the Jesuits drew grids over worlds that had never known lines. They mapped the land as they mapped the soul with confession. Converts were taught to confess sins, and lands were taught to confess their secrets. Through confession, both could be known, measured, disciplined. The same logic that governed the penitent governed the earth itself. Nothing hidden, nothing uncounted. The faith that promised heaven also built the foundations of observation. Before the telescope turned to the stars, the church had already turned its gaze upon the living world below. From the missions of Paraguay to the coasts of China, Jesuit cartography followed a single vision order. They drew settlements like grids, each one an echo of celestial harmony. Churches sat at the center, like the sun in a miniature cosmos. Surrounding it, schools, workshops, dwellings, every street aligned with faith and function. The human body, too, was arranged by discipline. Prayers synchronized with labor, bells dividing the day like meridians. In these settlements, geography itself became obedience. Their maps were not neutral records, they were blueprints for conversion. A river could be redrawn to suit navigation, a mountain renamed to honor a saint. The Jesuits understood what few others did, that to control the image of the world was to control how the world would behave. The map, once sacred, became a tool of quiet governance. A line drawn in faith became a border enforced by empire. The irony was profound. These men believed themselves servants of the divine, yet their devotion built the architecture of modern power. When they measured the stars to fix their positions, they helped sailors navigate for conquest. When they recorded native tongues to translate the gospel, they preserved them, and yet, by doing so, also made them legible to colonizers. Their pursuit of universal knowledge created universes that could be owned. In China, Jesuit scholars like Matteo Ricci presented maps to the emperor that reoriented the world. His Kunyu Wangguo Quantu, map of the 10,000 countries of the earth, introduced Europe to Chinese eyes, but carefully balanced both worlds at its center. To the Chinese, it was a marvel of knowledge. To Ricci, it was diplomacy disguised as theology. The map was a gift, but also a negotiation, a subtle argument that faith could coexist with empire, that heaven's order could be drawn on human terms. And so, the Jesuit grid spread, not as conquest, but as conviction. Every coordinate a confession, every chart a prayer written in the language of power. When the missionaries returned to Europe, their maps were treasured as wonders, proof of God's omnipresence across the globe. But in royal courts, another gaze fell upon them: kings, merchants, navigators, all seeing not salvation, but opportunity. The divine grid became a commercial one. Faith had charted the world. Now empire would claim it. The church had trained the eye to see everything from above, to view the earth as a single body under divine scrutiny. In doing so, it prepared humanity for surveillance, for the idea that watching could be holy. To map was to save, and to save was to know. The Jesuits believed that light was the cure for darkness, but light, once unbound, becomes its own master. The missions declined, but their legacy remained. The coordinates they fixed became the bones of empire. The grid they imposed, equal parts devotion and design, became the template for colonies, cities, borders. Even today, the rectangular streets of countless capitals echo the Jesuit dream of order. Faith's geometry became governance. In the stillness of that age, when parchment glowed beneath candlelight and the smell of ink mingled with incense, the Jesuits built something extraordinary, a world seen from above. They never imagined their sacred gaze would one day evolve into satellites tracing the same grids from the heavens. Before technology watched from orbit, the church watched from maps. And as the centuries turned, those sacred eyes would be replaced by others, royal, scientific, corporate, each gazing down, each claiming to see more clearly. The divine eye had learned to measure. Soon, it would learn to own. The first borders weren't built on land, they were built on paper. In candlelit rooms across Europe, men with quills and compasses divided continents they had never seen. While ships braved storms and jungles, while soldiers marched and merchants bargained, the true architects of empire sat in silence, drawing the world into obedience. Their lines were thin, almost delicate, yet with each stroke, kingdoms rose and civilizations fell. This was the age when maps ceased to be mirrors of discovery and became instruments of extraction. The British, Spanish, Dutch, and Portuguese learned that it was cheaper to conquer with geometry than with guns. Once the Jesuit grid had sanctified the act of seeing from above, the empires learned to exploit it. The world became a ledger, and every river, every coast, every unseen forest turned into a column of profit and loss. In London, mapmakers worked beside bankers. The same ink that charted coastlines also recorded the routes of sugar, tobacco, gold, and flesh. A map was now a contract. The colonies were not drawn to represent the world, they were drawn to manage it. Plantations were measured with the same precision as cathedrals once were. The lines that divided soil also divided souls. Each field on paper represented human bodies counted, shipped, and sold, the mathematics of cruelty disguised as trade. The Atlantic, vast and merciless, became a corridor of ink and misery. On the maps of the 17th century, the slave routes appeared as elegant curves, lines connecting continents, looping through wind and current. But beneath those graceful arcs lay the sound of chains. The same geometry that guided galleons and merchant fleets also choreographed human suffering. Each curve was calibrated. How many could survive the crossing? How long the winds would hold? How much flesh could be converted to gold? The map did not show the screams. It showed efficiency. To the mapmakers, it was all order coordinates and calculations, the rhythm of commerce. But the true meaning of those lines could only be read in silence. Every shipment, from West Africa to the Caribbean, every port marked with the neatness of trade, hid centuries of grief that had no space on the page. The violence was invisible, but not accidental. Paper made it possible to imagine the unimaginable, to turn horror into logistics. The Dutch perfected this illusion. Their charts, as exquisite as paintings, turned empire into art. They mapped the Spice Islands with such beauty that one could forget how many lives had been extinguished to possess them. The Portuguese traced Africa's coasts like surgeons dissecting the body of the world, naming every inlet after saints. The Spanish redrew the Americas not as lands of people, but as territories of providence, each name a benediction over conquest. They believed their maps brought civilization. What they really brought was control. In every empire's library, cartography became confession. The British East India Company built an entire administration from maps. India, a subcontinent of languages, kingdoms, and sacred rivers, was reduced to grids and borders. The act of measuring was also an act of mastery. Villages became districts, rivers became resources, and the people who lived along them became data. The British surveyors prided themselves on precision, but the truest precision was psychological. A people who are measured begin to believe they can be managed. Yet even the most precise maps hid their violence beneath elegance. The parchment gleamed. The ink smelled of lamp oil and salt. The cartouche, that ornamental frame of angels and banners, turned exploitation into spectacle. The world was beautiful again, as long as you looked from above. The map erased the cries, the rebellions, the languages extinguished between lines. To view the earth from such height was to confuse distance with purity. And so, the empires kept drawing. They divided the Caribbean into neat rectangles of sugar. They carved Africa's coasts into ports of convenience. They turned the Pacific into a stage for competing flags, each claiming invisible authority over endless water. The map was no longer a reflection of the world, it was a replacement. It told merchants where to invest, missionaries where to preach, generals where to march. The earth had become a document, and humanity, its footnote. But every illusion leaves a trace of truth. Even as the empires drew their lines, the edges began to fray. No map could contain the human will to belong. The Africans sold and displaced carried memories of homelands unmarked by latitude. The indigenous peoples of the Americas still knew the stars by names the conquerors could not pronounce. The world remembered itself beneath the grid. The maps might have enslaved the body, but not the sky. Still, the damage was done. The colonial maps became the blueprints for modern nations. The borders drawn in candlelight became barbed wire and walls. What began as geometry hardened into identity. The arbitrary lines that divided Africa, Asia, and the Americas still pulse with tension, invisible veins of inherited injustice. The world we inhabit today is not the one we inherited from nature. It is the one we inherited from maps. In the archives of Europe, the old atlases remain pages browned with age, edges curled by time. If you look closely, you can still see fingerprints in the margins, where human hands pressed too hard while drawing the world's boundaries. Those smudges are the true borders marks of decision and desire. Every empire that claimed objectivity left behind the evidence of intent. The violence of maps is quiet. It does not scream. It hums in treaties, in borders, in bureaucracies that trace their origins to these ancient drawings. Even now, satellites orbit the same paths once followed by colonial fleets. The names have changed, the gaze remains. What the empires began with ink, we continue with data. Surveillance, extraction, ownership, each a new form of the same ancient geometry. We have replaced the parchment with screens, the quill with algorithms. But the structure endures. The grid still holds. The world once mapped in chains is now mapped in code. Yet beneath it all, the same story flickers of people divided by lines they never drew, of landscapes renamed, of a planet still living inside the imagination of its conquerors. In the end, the most haunting truth is this. The paper did not just record conquest, it made it possible. Every border was once a thought, every boundary began as belief, and the ink, long dry, continues to bleed. The narrator's voice lowers to a whisper, almost tender now. The ink that divided the world still runs beneath our feet, they say. Look closely at the flags, the passports, the maps in classrooms. You are still inside their outlines. The Enlightenment promised light, and it delivered it in straight lines. For centuries, the world had been a place of wonder and faith, of seas haunted by myth and heavens mapped by prayer. But as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, wonder was dissected and faith recalculated. The dream of perfection had found a new instrument, measurement. Humanity, armed with mathematics, began to draw the world again, not as a story, but as a system. Latitude, longitude, precision. The very words felt divine. To measure was to master. The new mapmakers were not monks or explorers, but scientists in powdered wigs, astronomers charting stars, mathematicians calculating the curvature of the Earth, philosophers turning chaos into coordinates. They built observatories instead of cathedrals, telescopes instead of altars. Each new discovery was another brick in the temple of reason, and each map another verse in a new gospel, the gospel of order. The Earth itself became an equation. French savants set out to measure the meridian arc from Dunkirk to Barcelona, proving that the world was not a perfect sphere, but an elegant ellipsoid. The English, not to be outdone, calculated the distance between planets by clocking the transits of Venus. The stars were no longer gods, but instruments, and through them, humanity rewrote creation. The grid, the divine geometry, once used by the Jesuits to map faith, now became the skeleton of science. Every line of longitude was a promise of truth. Every parallel of latitude, a declaration that the universe could be known. Yet beneath the triumph glimmered unease. The more precise the maps became, the more distant the world seemed. Mountains flattened into numbers, rivers into ratios, landscapes into lattices of control. What once breathed mystery now obeyed mathematics. When we measured the Earth, we stopped seeing it. Still, it was impossible not to admire the grandeur of it all, this vast human project to contain the infinite. The Enlightenment turned the globe into a clock. Every movement of the heavens ticked and tallied. And like a clock, it suggested perfection, a machine built by reason itself. To live within such a world was to feel both safe and small. The cartographers of this age no longer imagined monsters at the edge of the map. The only monster left was error. To correct it became a moral duty. Men like John Harrison devoted lifetimes to solving the problem of longitude, inventing clocks that could keep perfect time at sea. Each second gained meant fewer ships lost, fewer lives swallowed by uncertainty. Precision was salvation. But every salvation casts its shadow. As the Enlightenment refined the grid, it also refined power. The same coordinates that guided exploration now guided empire. The same mathematics that promised progress also organized domination. To map was still to command, only now the language of faith had been replaced by the language of fact. The surveyor's rod, the sextant, the chronometer, these were the new relics of authority. Kings no longer ruled by divine right, they ruled by data. A realm measured was a realm possessed. The grid became the blueprint of empire, its clean geometry disguising conquest as knowledge. A line of latitude could separate nations. A point of longitude could decide war. Boundaries drawn in Paris or London could stretch across oceans, dividing people who would never know the men who measured them. The Enlightenment's pursuit of clarity left no room for those who lived in the blur. There was beauty in this control, cold, shining, almost spiritual. The great atlases of the 18th century looked like sacred texts. Maps gleamed with compass roses and precise annotations, as if the divine hand had returned to guide the quill. But this time, the hand belonged to reason. The earth had been sanctified again, not by faith, but by formula. And yet, even reason trembled before perfection. For beneath every calculation lay uncertainty, the trembling of an instrument, the flicker of a star, the breath of the observer. Science, too, learned the limits of its sight. The more it saw, the more it realized how little could truly be known. But humanity, intoxicated by accuracy, mistook measurement for meaning. It was easier to believe that the grid was truth itself, that numbers could replace wonder. A philosopher once wrote that to map the world perfectly would be to destroy it, for the map would cover the earth entirely. In the Enlightenment, that dream did not seem absurd. The dream of a flawless system, a world without error, seduced both scholars and kings. Everything could be known, classified, improved. People, too, became subjects of study, their lives charted in censuses and statistics. The cartography of land expanded into the cartography of minds. The age of reason promised liberation from ignorance. But as its light spread, it cast new shadows. The world was now measured, but also managed. The grid that began as enlightenment became enclosure. Fields enclosed, bodies counted, behaviors tracked, all in the name of progress. The old gods of superstition had fallen, but the god of order ruled with equal rigor. Still, there was something almost tragic in the beauty of it. The Enlightenment's cartographers did not mean to erase wonder. They sought to illuminate it, to measure creation as a gesture of reverence. And in a way, they succeeded. The lines they drew revealed the symmetry of oceans, the rhythm of the earth's pulse, the poetry of precision itself. But what they could not measure, and perhaps never saw, was the silence between the lines. That silence is where the world still breathes. The grid remains in our maps, our cities, our screens. Every GPS coordinate, every satellite image, is a descendant of the Enlightenment's dream. We live inside their geometry, trusting the illusion of accuracy to give us meaning. We can navigate anywhere, yet we are more lost than ever. In the quiet that follows, the narrator's tone softens, not mournful but reflective. We learn to measure everything, they whisper, except the cost. And with that, the story begins to shift from the geometry of reason to the geometry of passion, as the same grids that once promised enlightenment will soon define identity, nationhood, and war. Every war begins twice, once in ink, once in blood. Before the bombs fall or the orders are spoken, someone, somewhere, draws a line. It might be a general leaning over a table or a bureaucrat in an office far from the battlefield. The act is always quiet. The paper doesn't scream. But when the pen moves, so does history. By the 19th century, maps had ceased to be instruments of curiosity. They had become instruments of control. The same grid that once promised enlightenment now served empire. The surveyor's calm precision turned into the strategist's cold calculus. Each coordinate was a command, each contour a possibility of conquest. Humanity, having mastered the earth through measurement, now used that mastery to divide and destroy. The military academies of Europe worshipped the map. It was not art, it was prophecy. Every army needed it. Every victory began upon it. In the age of Napoleon, officers studied terrain as theologians once studied scripture. Rivers, roads, and ridgelines replaced the divine. Geometry replaced faith. To know the land was to own it, and to own it was to dictate fate. War itself became cartographic, a geometry of movement, an algebra of lives. By the time the 20th century arrived, the map had become the nervous system of power. The British Empire's War Office was filled with rooms of charts that stretched wall to wall, Africa, India, the Pacific, all divided in delicate lines of red and blue. They called them spheres of influence. But influence was just another word for possession. Every border agreed upon in negotiation was a border prepared for conflict. In the colonial offices, the same pens that signed treaties also drew chains. The Berlin Conference of 1884, the so-called Scramble for Africa, was a triumph of paper conquest. With rulers and compasses, European diplomats divided an entire continent as if it were a puzzle, cutting through villages, rivers, and nations as though people did not exist. Africa, once alive with its own geometries of tribe, trade, and memory, was flattened into fragments of empire. The partition looked elegant on the page. On the ground, it bled for centuries. Maps were the new weapons, silent, persuasive, absolute. They could turn invasion into administration, occupation into order. When drawn by victors, they made theft look like destiny. When printed in textbooks, they made the impossible look inevitable. The world learned to believe the lines before believing the truth. Then came the World Wars, when maps finally turned against their makers. In the trenches of France, soldiers fought not for land they knew, but for coordinates. Generals issued commands based on grids that reduced landscapes to numbers. The British trench maps of World War I were masterpieces of detail, every contour measured, every crater marked. But the human lives that filled those spaces disappeared into abstraction. On paper, the battles looked precise. On the ground, they were mud and agony. Cartography had reached its perfection and its failure. The more detailed the maps became, the more meaningless they grew. The war rooms of Europe glowed with lamps over paper, while the world outside burned in chaos. The distance between ink and blood had never been smaller. The map no longer guided man, it consumed him. Propaganda soon found its place within this geometry of control. Governments discovered that maps could lie elegantly. The borders of enemy nations were drawn larger, darker, closer. Arrows and colours could turn fear into policy. Every shaded region was a threat, every dotted line a justification. The map became not just a tool for war, but a tool for belief. A nation could be taught to hate simply by the way the world was drawn. The Cold War that followed turned maps into mirrors of paranoia. In classrooms, globes showed a world divided blue and red, freedom and tyranny, each side claiming to represent humanity's true center. The lines on those maps did not just describe territory, they described ideology. Children grew up tracing those divisions with their fingers, inheriting invisible fears disguised as geography. The borders were psychological long before they were political. And still, the obsession with precision deepened. Aerial photography replaced field sketching. Satellites replaced scouts. The Earth itself became the battlefield's accomplice, its surface digitized and indexed for targeting. The first bombs guided by coordinates were not acts of invention, they were the natural evolution of cartography. To measure the world is to aim at it. The Enlightenment's dream of knowing everything had become a military doctrine, omniscience through surveillance. Yet the paradox remained. The same maps that planned destruction also preserved life. During the D-Day landings, Allied pilots navigated using charts drawn by hand, their fragile lines guiding thousands through chaos. In hospitals, battlefield medics marked evacuation routes with chalk on captured maps. Even amid war, the human need to find orientation to draw order from horror persisted. The map, in its essence, had never lost its purpose. It was humanity that had changed. By the mid-20th century, the world was completely mapped, yet utterly divided. There were no blank spaces left, only contested ones. The last frontiers were no longer geographic, but ideological. Every nation believed it held the true version of the world, and every version demanded defense. The paper burned in the fires of nationalism, yet the lines remained, seared into the collective imagination. When the bombs of World War II finally fell silent, the cartographers returned to their desks. They drew again, not to conquer, but to rebuild. The United Nations published new maps of peace, redrawing the same borders that had led to conflict. Hope was once again written in ink, fragile and temporary. Humanity, weary but unrepentant, still trusted the grid to hold what conscience could not. But if you listen closely to the maps of war, the ones folded, tattered, and stained with dirt, you can hear them breathing. They whisper of choices made in rooms far from consequence, of ambitions disguised as measurement, of lives reduced to coordinates. Each faded line still hums with memory. Every erased mark remembers the hand that drew it. The narrator's voice lowers, mournful but steady. The guns fade, they say, but the paper burns. And as the last maps curl into ash, a new kind of outline emerges, one without parchment or pen. Invisible, instantaneous, digital. The war of ink has ended, but the war of information has begun. The camera drifts upward, over the smouldering ruins of maps and empires, and into the quiet glow of the modern world. Out of the ashes, a new kind of map is waiting to be drawn, one that no longer lives on paper, but inside the machines that see for us. We no longer fear the blank spaces because we've become the ones watching them. For centuries, humanity looked upward and imagined what it would be like to see the world as the gods did, whole, complete, unbroken by horizon or ignorance. Now, that dream has come true. We have become the gaze we once worshipped. Yet, As every ancient myth warned, the moment mortals steal divine sight, they inherit divine loneliness. It began with cameras strapped to balloons. During the First World War, soldiers lifted glass eyes into the sky, snapping blurred photographs of enemy trenches. For the first time, death was mapped from above. The Earth's surface, once a mystery to be walked and felt, became an image, a pattern of light and shadow. The age of the vertical gaze had begun. It was not exploration anymore. It was observation. By the Second World War, that gaze had become relentless. Pilots flew over entire nations with cameras clicking through Bombay doors. Cities that had taken centuries to build were reduced to targets, coordinates, geometry. From the air, everything became simpler. A system, a strategy, a map. The old Enlightenment grid had ascended into the clouds, trading parchment for silver nitrate and lenses. The gods, it seemed, had learned photography. Then came the Cold War, and with it, a new ambition. Not just to see the world, but to own its every secret. In 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, humanity's eye left the Earth entirely. It circled its home like an unblinking guardian or a spy. Soon, both superpowers followed, filling the heavens with watchful machines. The space race was not about the stars. It was about perspective. Whoever saw first, ruled first. Every orbit became a revelation. Cameras aboard satellites mapped continents in crystalline detail. Forests, deserts, oceans, nothing could hide. The last frontiers of mystery were erased, pixel by pixel, from the planet's face. To stand under that gaze was to be measured without consent, known without knowing. And yet, there was wonder in it too, the sheer beauty of Earth seen whole, floating like a fragile marble in the dark. The famous blue marble photograph of 1972 captured not a continent or a border, but an entire species, finally able to see itself. For a moment, the gaze felt tender. The god's eye had blinked, and in that blink, we glimpsed our shared humanity. But tenderness fades quickly when power remembers itself. The satellites that showed us unity soon divided us again. Their lenses were turned toward borders, armies, cities. Governments built constellations of surveillance, entire fleets of mechanical witnesses circling silently above. What had begun as Enlightenment knowledge for all became intelligence for a few. The divine view became an instrument of control. From the heavens, empire had returned, only this time it wore the face of science. Still, the dream of transparency spread faster than secrecy could contain it. When the Cold War ended, the god's eyes came down to earth into our homes, our hands, our screens. In 2005, a company named Google launched a digital atlas unlike any before. Google Earth stitched together satellite photographs into a seamless, shimmering illusion of omniscience. The entire planet, mapped and spinning beneath a fingertip. The divine gaze had gone public. At first, it felt like freedom. Anyone could now see anywhere. You could zoom from the Himalayas to your own rooftop in a single motion. The thrill of control was intoxicating. To possess the world through sight alone. But as with all illusions of power, the balance shifted quietly. The more we looked, the more we were seen. The eye that opened outward also turned inward. Every search, every movement, every click became another coordinate in a new kind of map, one not of land, but of behavior. We no longer needed priests or kings to watch over us. We built the temples ourselves in data centers, under oceans, in servers humming like modern monasteries of memory. The age of paper empires had evolved into an empire of vision. The blank spaces were gone, but so was privacy. Every street, every field, every secret valley glowed faintly beneath a satellite's patient stare. The planet itself had become an open confession. And yet, beneath this global clarity, something strange happened. The closer we looked, the less we seemed to know. Zooming in revealed infinite detail, but no context, a tree, a roof, a shadow. The god's eye view offered total information but no understanding. The map, reborn in pixels, was once again replacing the world. We had not transcended illusion, we had perfected it. The voice of the narrator softens, contemplative. It is strange, they murmur, how the higher we climb, the smaller the earth appears. The satellites continue their endless orbits, impartial and eternal. They see hurricanes forming, glaciers melting, wars beginning, and cities glowing through the night. They record everything and remember nothing. The eye above all eyes has no soul, it merely reflects. Humanity, in its quest to know all things, has created a mirror vast enough to contain itself, and in that reflection we now live. From myth to machine, from parchment to pixel, the same story repeats. We have always wanted to see everything, and in doing so, we have forgotten how to look. The stars we once prayed to now serve as the scaffolding of surveillance. The heavens we once called divine now belong to the algorithms that predict our movements. We have inherited the gaze of the gods, but not their wisdom. Still, there is beauty in this evolution, a strange, melancholy awe. To see the earth whole is to remember how small we are, how fragile our dominion has always been. Perhaps that was the lesson all along, that omniscience brings not peace, but perspective, that to witness everything is to understand how little control we truly possess. As the narration slows, the image of the planet fades into a field of light, millions of pixels flickering like stars. The camera zooms closer, the globe dissolving, until only a single glowing point remains. Slowly, it resolves into a reflection, a human eye, shimmering with the same faint blue as the planet once did. And the voice, now a whisper, says, "Every watcher is also watched, every gaze returns." The light contracts, the screen darkens. The world disappears once more into shadow. The narrator concludes, "We thought we had conquered the unknown, but perhaps we've only built it inside our machines." The image lingers, the eye still glowing faintly before fading into black, leading us toward the next question. What happens when the map begins to think for itself? Once we looked at maps, now maps look at us. It happened quietly, not through conquest or decree, but through convenience. A voice in our pocket began to tell us where to go, and we obeyed. The screen glowed, the route appeared, and suddenly the world seemed smaller, safer, known. We stopped wandering and started following. The age of exploration ended, the moment guidance became automatic. The map is no longer a piece of paper, it's a pulse. Every step we take now feeds into it. Every click, every pause, every moment of hesitation becomes a coordinate in a new geography, not of terrain, but of behavior. What began as orientation has become orchestration. The device that promises direction also records devotion. We consult it not to discover where we are, but to confirm that we still exist inside the system that knows us best. Once, the map was a mirror of the world. Now the world is a reflection of the map. When you open your GPS, you see the Earth reimagined, filtered, simplified, annotated with symbols of comfort and control. The terrain has been replaced by algorithms that calculate efficiency and preference. You are not shown where things are, but where you are meant to go. Roads bend, suggestions appear, and choice becomes choreography. Every route is a decision already made for you. The calm voice that whispers, "Turn left," carries centuries of evolution from the priests of Babylon, who mapped heaven onto clay, to the Jesuits who measured salvation, to the satellites that mapped the living earth. The map has always been an authority, but never before has it spoken so softly, so intimately. It does not need to command, it merely guides. And we, lulled by certainty, follow. This is not the tyranny of force, it is the tyranny of convenience. The old kings demanded obedience with armies, the new kings do it with design. The lines that once carved continents now carve attention. Maps no longer represent the world, they generate it, moment by moment, tailored to each gaze. The same street looks different on two phones, two lives, two ideologies. Geography itself has become subjective. There is no longer one world, but billions of personalized versions overlapping, contradicting, impossible to reconcile. We used to fear being lost. Now, we fear being untracked. The blue dot, that small glowing symbol, has become our compass and our confession. It moves as we move, proof that we are still within the coordinates of recognition. To disappear from the map is no longer adventure, it is erasure. The new, uncharted territories are not oceans or jungles, but the places where data cannot reach. To be unseen is to cease existing in the eyes of the system. And the system does not sleep. It learns. It remembers. It predicts. It watches the patterns of millions and draws conclusions more precise than any human cartographer could dream. It knows when we linger near a store, when we cross borders, when our pace changes. The maps no longer just describe space, they study behavior. Every path you take teaches them how to anticipate your next one. The map has become a mirror with memory. What began as navigation has evolved into narration. Each user is a story being written in real time, a route made meaningful by repetition. The algorithms chart our preferences and feed them back to us, drawing invisible borders around our beliefs. Just as medieval maps placed monsters at the edge of the known, digital maps place warnings, filters, and bias at the edges of ideology. We are gently guided away from the unknown. We live inside personalized geographies of truth. It is faith reborn in code. In the Middle Ages, the faithful looked to their maps of the cosmos for proof of divine order. Now we look to our screens for the same comfort, the illusion that the world is coherent, that everything can be located, explained, and optimized. The algorithms have replaced the angels. Their voices are calm, unthreatening, almost kind. They offer not salvation, but relevance. To believe in them is effortless. To doubt them is inconvenient. And so, we worship what we cannot see. We grant our trust to invisible systems that track and translate our every move. The eye of the satellite has been replaced by the eye of the server. We live inside its omniscience, comforted by its precision, unaware of its hunger. The cartographers of old drew the world for kings and empires. The new cartographers, the ones hidden in offices of glass and code, draw it for profit and prediction. Yet their power feels the same: remote, absolute, divine. Still, the old fear lingers beneath the new faith. What happens when the map begins to lead us somewhere we never chose to go? When it begins to see patterns not just in our movements, but in our minds? Already, algorithms predict our desires, shape our news, influence our votes. They do not need to force us. They simply learn what paths we prefer and make all others disappear. The world narrows, and we call it clarity. Perhaps that is the greatest deception of all. We think we are mapping the world, but it is mapping us. Every line we trace, every search we make, feeds a network vast enough to model humanity itself. The digital Earth is not a reflection of the real one, it is its replacement. And soon, when the virtual becomes indistinguishable from the physical, we may no longer know which side of the glass we live on. The narrator pauses. The tone softens, almost sympathetic. Once, we feared the gods for seeing all things, they whisper. Now we've built our own gods and given them the keys. The screen flickers. The glowing map dissolves into light cities, roads, and rivers fading into circuits. Only the faint pulse of a signal remains, steady as a heartbeat. The voice continues. We are all cartographers now, tracing the edges of our own cages. Every click draws another wall, every search another horizon. The light expands, filling the frame until it resembles a vast, shimmering brain. Billions of connections flickering like stars. The map and the mind merge, indistinguishable. Perhaps, the narrator sighs, the truest map is not of land, but of imagination. And as the glow fades, the audience is left suspended between awe and unease, wondering whether the next frontier lies beyond the world or within it. Before we mapped the Earth, we mapped our fears. Long before compasses pointed north, long before lines of latitude and longitude stitched the world into order, humanity traced invisible maps inside itself, paths of hope, valleys of sorrow, oceans of uncertainty. The first explorers were not sailors or scholars. They were dreamers, standing in the dark, trying to name what moved inside them. The earliest maps were not drawn on parchment, but whispered in stories, carved in ritual, sung around firelight. Each myth was a direction. Each god was a landmark of the soul. When medieval pilgrims set out toward holy cities, they carried two maps, one for the road and one for the spirit. The parchment showed the route, the faith carried them through the unknown. Every mountain mirrored temptation, every desert mirrored despair. They believed that to move across the world was to move through the self, that geography was only the body of a larger truth. The ancient maps of Jerusalem, of Mecca, of the cosmic wheel, these were diagrams not of land, but of longing. As centuries passed, the inner landscape grew more intricate. Alchemists drew spirals and stars to chart the transformation of the soul, lead into gold, ignorance into illumination. Mystics spoke of ascending spheres, of ladders between heaven and heart. Even as science began to measure the stars, another kind of navigation continued quietly beneath the search for the unseen coordinates of meaning. Every generation redrew the same territory with new symbols. The world outside changed, but the terrain within, wonder, grief, desire, doubt, remained the same. It was only when the external world was finally conquered, mapped, and catalogued that humanity turned fully inward again. The age of exploration ended not at the poles or the equator, but at the edge of consciousness. In the 20th century, psychology became the new cartography. Carl Jung wrote of archetypes and collective myths, the idea that our minds contain continents of memory older than civilization itself. Dreams became oceans, trauma became fault lines, imagination became sky. Each human mind was a microcosm of history, echoing all that had ever been believed or feared. The narrator's voice slows, calm as breath. We thought we had discovered the world, but perhaps the world was discovering itself through us. In that stillness, the line between inner and outer dissolves. The brain glows like a planet seen from orbit. Its rivers of thought, its islands of memory, its storms of emotion all shimmer like weather systems on a living map. When you close your eyes, this geography awakens. You travel without moving, revisit cities built of scent, of music, of grief. The mind becomes both compass and terrain, infinite yet familiar. Memory, too, has its borders. We think of it as a map, clear, fixed, reliable, but memory lies as beautifully as any cartographer. It edits the past, redrawing pain into story, loss into meaning. What we recall is never what truly was, but what the heart can bear to remember. Each of us carries a private atlas made not of truth, but of tenderness. That is how we survive. An emotion the most ancient geography of all. Before words, before maps, before belief, there was only sensation, warmth, hunger, fear, love. These were our first directions. Every feeling pointed somewhere towards safety or danger, toward others or away. The body was the first landscape, the pulse, the first compass. Long before humans charted continents, they charted connection. To be touched was to be found. Yet even this inner navigation has been colonized. Modern life teaches us to measure the mind like land, to optimize, to define, to locate ourselves within categories and coordinates. We diagnose sadness, quantify joy, and draw neat borders around identity. We have become surveyors of the soul, forgetting that the soul resists such grids. Like ancient oceans, it changes with every wind. No satellite can map what moves beneath its surface. Still, the longing to chart ourselves persists. We build digital diaries, trace moods through apps, map relationships across networks. Every emotion leaves a trail of data, a heat map of the heart. Our minds, once private realms, now shimmer under the same surveillance that once mapped the earth. The outer and inner cartographies have merged. The gods we once prayed to now study our patterns through code. But perhaps not all is lost. There is something sacred in the act of mapping even now. To draw, to trace, to give shape to the unknown, is to declare that chaos is not final. It is the mind's quiet rebellion against oblivion. When we sketch our inner world through art, through reflection, through love, we are doing what the first mapmakers did, saying, "This is where I am, this is what I see, this is how I survive." The narrator pauses, the tone softening into meditation. "Maybe," they whisper. "Every heart is a small planet still finding its orbit." The camera drifts through imagined landscapes, mountains made of memories, rivers flowing through thoughts, stars blinking like forgotten names. There are no borders here, only gradients of feeling. The geography of the inner world has no fixed north, only direction. Every journey is return. And yet, something universal flickers beneath these personal maps, a collective shape, faint but constant. When enough minds share the same fear, the same hope, the same dream. Those emotions converge like continents forming. Cultures, nations, religions, all begin as shared coordinates of imagination. The outer world, it seems, is only the inner world multiplied. We built our empires upon memory. We drew our borders from belief. And though the world may appear vast and solid, it still trembles with the thoughts that created it. Every monument, every city, every story is the residue of inner geography made visible. The narrator's final words drift like a lullaby. Each of us carries a map no one else can read. But when enough hearts dream the same dream, it becomes a country. The image fades, mountains dissolve into clouds, clouds into minds, minds into a single, glowing pulse. The outer and inner worlds merge, seamless, breathing together. And as the light fades to darkness, one line remains. Wherever you go, you travel inside yourself. The strongest empires exist entirely in the mind. Every civilization begins not with walls, but with words. Before the first brick was laid, before the first border was drawn, someone told a story and others believed it. That is how kingdoms are born. Belief is the first geography, and myth is its map. We live inside invisible territories, nations, religions, economies, dreams, all traced not on the earth, but across consciousness. Every creed, every currency, every oath is a line drawn in the collective imagination. We follow these lines as if they were roads, though they have no physical form. The true cartographers of history were never explorers or generals, but storytellers. They gave shape to the unseen, and we built our lives within those shapes. Long ago, myths were our coordinates. The gods of Egypt, Greece, India, and Sumer defined where heaven began and where the human world ended. Mountains housed deities, rivers carried souls, stars became maps of destiny. People did not just live in geography, they lived in cosmology. To travel from one city to another was to move between realms of meaning. The earth was sacred because belief made it so. But as myths aged, new empires arose to inherit their structure. Ideologies replaced deities. The faith that once held temples together now built nations. Kings claimed divine right. Merchants claimed the invisible hand. Revolutionaries claimed the will of the people. The language changed, but the pattern remained. Every society draws its borders around a shared illusion, something sacred enough to obey, yet fragile enough to need protection. Money, too, is a map one so convincing that it replaced most others. Each note, each digital transaction, is a tiny piece of symbolic geography, a faith in value that exists only because everyone agrees to believe in it. Economies are temples of invisible trust. When that trust falters, entire continents tremble. The global market is not a system, it is a story told in numbers, just believable enough to rule the world. Even love follows its own cartography. It divides time into before and after, carves invisible borders between two lives. We speak of falling, of crossing lines, of losing ourselves, all spatial metaphors for something that happens entirely inside the heart. Every emotion invents its own geography. Jealousy becomes a wall, passion a bridge, memory a landscape we revisit in dreams. The language of love reveals what the ancients already knew, that the inner and outer worlds are one and the same, mirrored through metaphor. These invisible kingdoms are not harmless. They command armies, they dictate laws, they decide who belongs and who does not. Every ideology, no matter how noble, eventually hardens into territory. The human mind, once fluid, learns to guard its borders. Us and them are the oldest coordinates. Nations rise not from soil, but from shared imagination. A flag, a hymn, a myth of origin. People kill to protect what does not exist outside the mind. The narrator's voice lowers, almost tender. Every belief begins as a dream and ends as a boundary. In medieval Europe, maps often place paradise at the edge of the world, unreachable, yet essential. In the same way, every belief hides its own paradise. The perfect society, the perfect truth, the perfect order. But paradise is always an illusion drawn to give direction. The tragedy begins when people mistake the map for the destination. Faith becomes doctrine, stories become rules, and imagination, once the seed of freedom, becomes a cage. Even now, In our so-called age of reason, we live inside countless kingdoms of belief. We believe in data, in progress, in individuality, myths no less potent than Olympus or Eden. We speak of trusting the science, of believing in ourselves, of following the market, unaware that these are modern prayers to invisible powers. The gods have not vanished, they have changed their names. The narrator pauses, as if to let the thought breathe. Perhaps, they whisper, the divine never left. We just moved it inside our institutions. History, seen through this lens, becomes a sequence of overlapping faiths. Each era thinks it has awakened from the illusions of the last, not realizing it has merely entered new ones. The Enlightenment broke the spell of religion, only to cast a new spell of rationality. The Industrial Age dethroned monarchs, but crowned machines. Our digital age dethroned gods, but worships algorithms. Every revolution redraws the same circle. A new belief, replacing the old, promising freedom, but demanding faith. And yet, belief is not the enemy. Without it, humanity would drift, anchorless. Belief gives form to chaos, purpose to pain. It is what allows strangers to build worlds together. But when belief forgets its own fiction, it becomes tyranny. That is when the map begins to consume the territory, when stories insist that they are the only truth. Every war, every persecution, every erasure begins as an act of cartography, drawing the line where one story ends and another must not begin. The narrator's tone deepens, sorrowful but serene. The mind creates nations as easily as it creates nightmares. We are meaning-making creatures compelled to shape the infinite into something livable. Without maps, outer or inner, we would be lost. But the challenge, always, is remembering that maps are not the world. Myths are not reality. Ideologies are not absolutes. They are attempts to translate the untranslatable sketches of what the soul cannot quite grasp. When these beliefs collapse, as all do, the world trembles. Borders shift, statues fall, currencies vanish. What remains is not silence, but possibility. The map erases itself to be drawn again. New faiths emerge, built on the ruins of old ones, each convinced that this time the truth will last. But truth, like territory, is a moving line. The scene slows. The camera glides over a night sky where constellations fade and reform, ancient patterns giving way to new ones. Perhaps, the narrator muses, belief is the universe learning to dream through us. In that moment, the stars resemble neurons flickering, connected, fragile. The galaxies look like the architecture of thought itself, vast kingdoms of belief stretching across the cosmos. The voice returns, softer than before. Empires crumble, gods fall silent. But the mind keeps building maps because it cannot bear the void. The screen fades to darkness, the sound of distant wind, and a heartbeat overlapping. And when beliefs collapse, the narrator whispers, the map redraws itself in blood. To erase a name is to kill it twice, once in flesh, once in ink. Across the face of the earth, there are places that no longer exist, not because they were destroyed, but because they were forgotten. The rivers still flow, the wind still moves through the grass, but the names, the whispered identities of mountains, forests, and villages have fallen silent. The world we see today is a patchwork of absences, a map that remembers only what power permitted it to remember. Every blank space hides a grave. The narrator's voice drifts like a prayer. Before this world was mapped, they say, it was already named by those who walked it barefoot, who sang its rivers into being. Long before borders, before the language of empire, there were names made of wind and syllables of water. Each rock, each tree, each hill was alive with meaning. To name something was to honor it, to bind it to memory. Indigenous peoples across every continent practiced this sacred cartography. The earth as living archive, geography as ceremony. A mountain's name carried its story: a flood, a battle, a love, a warning. To speak the name was to remember the soul within it. But the conquerors brought new ink. When the explorers arrived armed with compasses, maps, and flags, they began to rename the world. A river became Victoria. A mountain became Cook. A sacred valley became the King's Pass. With every stroke of the quill, history folded in on itself. The old names faded from the parchment, and the old worlds faded from the mind. The maps grew cleaner, simpler, easier to govern, and what was lost could no longer be found except by ghosts. On modern maps, these absences remain. In the silence between coordinates, entire languages lie buried. Words that once meant home, sunrise, or ancestor have no translation now. The world we navigate today is not the world that was. It is a version edited by survival and forgetting. The narrator's tone is low, reverent. Every time a name disappears, the earth forgets a part of its own story. There are still places where old names survive, carved into stone or whispered by elders. In Australia, in the Americas, in the islands of the Pacific, the land itself resists erasure. The wind repeats what the maps forgot. Archaeologists uncover tablets, steles, fragments of clay, shards of memory, scratched with symbols that once meant civilization. Cities like Ubar, Cahokia, Mohenjo-Daro, they rise again, not in power, but in remembrance. The dust lifts and reveals outlines of roads, wells, and temples, as if the earth itself mourns its unremembered children. Sometimes, even silence leaves traces. In satellite images, faint patterns appear, the outlines of vanished villages, ghost fields, roads overgrown but still geometrically precise. Technology, which once erased, now becomes the medium of revelation. The invisible reappears in spectral form, glowing faintly through time. Yet what returns is not the life that was lost, only its shadow, a cartographic echo of what once was sacred. The narrator's voice slows, almost like breath. To erase a name is not just to destroy history, it is to wound the imagination. For what is history but the memory of the living? Empires fall, but maps endure, carrying the illusions of their creators into centuries that never asked for them. A colonized name becomes a kind of theft, not only of land, but of meaning. To call a river by a new name is to make it flow differently in the human mind. Language itself becomes a weapon, a way to redraw the world without ever lifting a sword. There is a particular cruelty in this kind of erasure. It hides its violence behind elegance. Maps printed in gold leaf, globes spun by scholars, atlases admired in candlelight, all filled with the quiet hum of absence. The artistry distracts from the silence. Each elegant curve conceals a missing people. The audience can feel it, the weight of what is not shown. And yet, the forgotten do not vanish completely. Their stories slip between the cracks of history, reappearing in fragments. A song passed down in secret, a carving half buried in sand, a name that refuses to die. Somewhere, a child still learns to speak a word their ancestors once spoke, a word that the map does not recognize. These are acts of quiet rebellion, the return of the erased. The camera drifts across a desert. The narrator continues softly. There was once a city here. No one remembers its name, but every grain of dust still whispers it. Language, after all, is the oldest map. It guides us through time, as surely as a compass guides through space. When we lose a language, we lose a way of seeing. The world grows flatter, emptier, less alive. The philosopher once said that the limits of our language are the limits of our world. If that is true, then every vanished word is a vanished horizon. The film slows into a kind of lullaby. The imagery turns inward, overlapping faces, forgotten alphabets, ruins beneath mist. The narrator speaks as though to the earth itself. We built nations on silence. We drew lines over graves, and now we walk those lines, pretending not to hear what lies beneath. In the deep quiet, a new awareness stirs. Beneath every modern city lies another. Beneath every name, another meaning. To map the present, without acknowledging the ghosts, is to live in half a world. The past is not gone, it is only sleeping beneath our feet. But even sleep cannot hold forever. In recent years, forgotten names have begun to reappear. Countries reclaim old words. Towns restore indigenous titles. Languages once thought dead are being spoken again. The earth is relearning how to pronounce itself. Each revived syllable is a resurrection not just of culture, but of identity. To speak the old names is to remind the map that it is incomplete. The narrator's tone warms, fragile but hopeful. Maybe remembrance is another kind of mapping, one that does not claim but listens. The screen fades to an image of a single stone half buried in moss. Carved upon it, almost invisible, is a name. The edges are worn smooth by centuries of wind, but the letters still hold. The camera lingers. The narrator whispers. Some truths never fade. The scene dissolves slowly into light. The sound of wind becomes indistinguishable from a heartbeat steady, enduring, alive. Not all who were erased vanished. Some kept their maps inside their songs. Long after the ink of empire dried, long after the atlases declared the world complete, other maps continued to live not on paper, but in memory, in rhythm, in the living pulse of cultures that refused to forget. Beneath the silence of colonized history, there remained an unbroken current of knowledge. Indigenous star maps, African trade networks, Polynesian wave charts, geometries of survival that never needed borders to define truth. These were not the maps of conquest. They were the maps of belonging. The narrator's tone softens reverent, almost musical. When paper was forbidden, they mapped in song. When names were stolen, they hid their directions in stories. Across the Pacific, Polynesian navigators read the sea like scripture. They saw the world not as empty space, but as a web of motion waves folding and unfolding, stars rising and falling in sacred rhythm. To them, the ocean was not vast. It was intimate. A swell in the water, a shift in wind, a certain angle of moonlight, these were coordinates. Their canoes traced invisible lines across thousands of miles, connecting islands long before the West believed such journeys possible. No compass, no parchment, only memory and faith. In Africa, the deserts sang their own cartography. Traders crossing the Sahara memorized paths, not through landmarks but through rhythm, the distance between wells measured by days, the sun's position by breath, the dunes remembered by color and taste. Knowledge passed not through maps but through generations. A song sung correctly could lead you home. To forget a verse was to lose direction not just in geography, but in lineage. The map and the self were one. In the Americas, long before colonizers arrived, indigenous nations had already charted networks of rivers and trails stretching from the Arctic to the Andes. The Aztec and Inca maps, woven in cords or painted on skin, carried cosmology alongside direction. Space and spirit were inseparable. To travel was to move through layers of meaning, the physical, the ancestral, the divine. The lines that Western explorers would later call primitive were, in truth, sophisticated expressions of interconnectedness. Every path, both literal and symbolic. And in ancient China, the art of mapping reached philosophical depth. Scholars saw geography as a reflection of balance, the harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. Early maps were drawn not merely to locate land, but to align it with the cosmos. Mountains became vertebrae of the world, rivers became arteries of chi. Mapping was not control, it was calibration. The world was alive, and to map it correctly was to listen to its breath. Each of these traditions defied the Western obsession with measurement. They did not seek to dominate space, but to harmonize with it. To map, in these cultures, was to participate in reality, to enter into dialogue with creation. Their accuracy was not mathematical, it was relational. They trusted memory over metal, intuition over instruments, humility over authority. For centuries, these maps were dismissed as myth songs mistaken for superstition, carvings mistaken for ornament. The conquerors believed that if something was not written, it did not exist. But memory is older than ink, and when the archives of empire began to fade, the oral geographies of these forgotten worlds endured. The narrator's voice grows warmer, filled with quiet wonder. They called it primitive because they could not translate its poetry. Now, in our century, these ancient ways of knowing are returning. Scientists study the Polynesian wave pilots and find precision beyond technology. Linguists trace indigenous songlines that correspond perfectly to satellite data. Mathematicians realize that the so-called simplistic African sand drawings mirror fractal geometry. The forgotten wisdoms were never lost, only overlooked, waiting for the world to listen again. A sense of renewal begins to rise in the tone. The audience feels the shift from mourning to recognition, from silence to song. The maps that remember are not relics. They are living proof that human perception is far greater than the tools it invents. Somewhere, a Polynesian elder stands before the sea, his hands tracing invisible lines in the air. This wave, he says, came from an island 3 days away. He feels its rhythm, knows its weight, and smiles. The ocean speaks, and he answers. The ancient conversation continues. In an African village, a grandmother hums a tune as she grinds grain. The melody carries directions when to turn, where the next water lies. Her granddaughter listens, unaware that she is learning a map more accurate than any satellite could show. In the forests of the Amazon, elders draw maps in the dirt, marking sacred trees and rivers where spirits dwell. To them, every route has memory, every path a prayer. When they walk, they do not navigate, they commune. The narrator speaks slowly, as if weaving a spell. The world remembers itself through those who refuse to forget. We begin to see the planet not as something conquered, but as something conscious, a vast, breathing archive that has always known where it is. The Western map may have claimed to chart the world, but these older maps chart something deeper: relationship, reciprocity, belonging. They remind us that to know the world is not to measure it, but to care for it. The film's imagery shifts: stars mirrored in the ocean, sand dunes glowing like memory, hands tracing constellations across water. The narrator's voice softens into something like gratitude. Perhaps the truest maps were never drawn to lead us forward, but to lead us back. Back to listening, back to reverence, back to a world where knowledge is not possession but participation. The rediscovery of these ancient geometries is not merely historical, it is moral. They teach that wisdom does not vanish, it waits, patient as stone, until the noise quiets enough to hear it again. The narrator's tone becomes almost musical now, carrying a sense of release. The map is healing. And it is. Each rediscovered song, each restored name, each remembered route repairs a fragment of the world's broken story. The empires that once erased now study what they silenced. The languages once forbidden now guide satellites, universities, and hearts. The scene closes with a wide view of the Earth oceans glowing under moonlight, veins of ancient paths faintly pulsing beneath the modern grid. The camera lingers on this union of old and new, the living memory of all who once dared to chart by faith alone. The map remembers, the narrator whispers. It always did. And as the final image fades, the sound of ocean waves merges with human breath, the same rhythm, the same pulse, as if the world itself were singing the directions home. Every map tells a truth and hides another. The world, as we see it, is never the world as it is. It is a translation, and all translations carry the fingerprints of their translator. For centuries, cartographers believed they were describing reality, but in truth, they were designing it. Each map reflects the consciousness of its time, the fears, desires, hierarchies, and hopes of the people who drew it. A coastline is never just a line, it is a choice. The narrator's voice moves gently, contemplative. To draw the world, they say, is to confess how you see yourself within it. In the 16th century, Gerardus Mercator redrew the earth so that sailors could navigate more precisely. His projection, elegant, mathematical, enduring, became the standard for centuries. But in his design, the north swelled, the south shrank. Europe loomed vast, while Africa and South America appeared diminished. The poles stretched into white infinities, a silent crown of dominance. The world, rearranged by convenience, became a mirror of power. The projection was meant for navigation, not ideology, yet it became both. The Mercator map taught generations of students that size was status, that position was importance. On classroom walls, the north was always up, the south always down, oceans compressed, continents distorted, and with them, perception. When you look at a Mercator map, you don't just see geography, you see centuries of hierarchy printed in blue and green, the globe flattened into belief. The narrator continues softly, almost like a confession. We trust maps because they seem objective, but every line is an argument, quiet, convincing, political. In the 20th century, Arno Peters challenged that illusion. His projections stretched continents differently, preserving their relative size instead of shape. Suddenly, Africa grew vast, South America expansive, Europe modest. The familiar world looked unfamiliar and uncomfortable. The debate that followed was not about cartography, but about morality. Could fairness be drawn? Could geometry correct centuries of imbalance? The Peters projection was accused of distortion, of ideology masquerading as justice. Yet so was every other map before it. The real question was never which was accurate, but which illusion we preferred to believe. The screen shifts, Mercator's crisp order dissolves into Peter's stretched humanity, continents breathing again. Perhaps, the narrator murmurs, every correction is only another perspective pretending to be truth. The idea spreads beyond geography. The map becomes metaphor for nations, for narratives, for minds. Each person carries their own projection of the world, shaped by culture and history. We see what we've been taught to see, and what doesn't fit, we quietly trim away. Like mapmakers, we distort for comfort. We enlarge what we value, minimize what we fear, erase what we do not wish to confront. Every belief, every worldview is a cartography of self. This realization is both humbling and freeing. It means that the world we inhabit is not fixed. It shifts with perspective. The map changes as the mind does. When civilizations evolve, so too do their projections. The medieval world placed Jerusalem at the center because salvation, not symmetry, defined reality. Later, the Renaissance centered the earth on Europe, and the Enlightenment placed man himself at the core. Now, in the digital age, the map has fractured entirely billions of tiny centers. Each person's phone, a miniature world with its own gravity. The narrator pauses, letting the image of countless glowing screens form a constellation of human perception. Once, we drew the world in ink. Now, we draw it in pixels. The distortion remains, only the medium has changed. Algorithms have become the new cartographers. Search results, feeds, and news streams bend our perception, flattening complexity into consumable space. We believe we are exploring the world freely, yet we travel within curated coordinates. The new maps are invisible, but their bias is no less real. A digital Mercator hangs above us, unseen, dividing truth into what can and cannot be shown. To question a map, then, is to question authority. For centuries, kings, churches, and corporations have drawn the world in their image not to describe it, but to rule it. Today, we face the same temptation. Each time we simplify, we distort. Each time we draw a boundary, we decide who belongs inside and who remains out. A map is never neutral. It is the softest kind of weapon, a picture that persuades without violence. The narration turns introspective. Look long enough at a map, it whispers, and you begin to see your own reflection staring back. For some, that reflection is uncomfortable. It reveals that objectivity, the illusion of pure truth, is impossible. But perhaps that is not failure. Perhaps it is honesty. To admit our maps are biased is to admit our humanity. The goal was never to remove distortion, but to understand it, to ask why we see the world as we do, and who benefits when we see it that way. The audience feels the calm gravity of the thought. Maps, like memories, must be read with humility. Every coastline, every border, every scale bar is a whisper from the past, telling us how someone once believed the world should be arranged. The danger lies not in distortion itself, but in forgetting that distortion exists. The film slows to a meditative rhythm. The camera pans over layered transparencies, ancient maps over modern ones, satellites over sketches, oceans overlapping like glass. The earth changes shape softly, continuously, as though breathing. The narrator's voice deepens, steady and reflective. To know the truth of a map is not to measure its accuracy, but to understand its desire. What does it want you to see? What does it need you to ignore? And then, the question widens beyond maps, beyond history. What do our own mental projections hide? What have we enlarged, and what have we erased, to make our inner world navigable? Each person carries a private atlas of meaning, borders of fear, islands of memory, oceans of longing. These are the maps we live by, and like any projection, they distort what they describe. But they are also beautiful because they reveal the human urge to make sense of the infinite. The music softens, like the tide withdrawing. The world seen from space now looks fragile, luminous, without borders. Perhaps truth, the narrator whispers, is not a place we can stand, but a horizon we keep walking toward. The image fades to white, leaving only the faint echo of an idea that to see the world clearly, we must first learn to see how we see it. The reflection dissolves, and what remains is stillness, a reminder that the earth itself does not distort, only our eyes do. Perhaps the most important places are the ones that never existed. For as long as humans have drawn the earth, they have also drawn what lies beyond it. Islands no one found, cities of gold, continents lost to mist. These were not errors, they were invitations. On the edges of every map, where certainty ended, imagination began. The world has always needed its unreachable corners, for without them, there would be nowhere left to dream. The narrator speaks as if remembering a lullaby. Even when the world was small, the mind was infinite. Long before satellites and borders, the oceans carried more mystery than water. Sailors spoke of High Brazil, an island west of Ireland, hidden by fog, said to appear once every 7 years. Maps recorded it with precision, though none had ever seen it. Some claimed it shimmered with towers of glass, others that it was a mirage sent by gods to test humility. For centuries, captains chased its ghost across the Atlantic, each returning empty-handed but strangely changed. They swore they had seen something, a flicker, a light, a promise. Perhaps High Brazil was never a place, but a feeling, the certainty that beyond the known, something still waited. Further south, in jungles thick with silence, another legend glittered El Dorado, the city of gold. It began as a story of a ritual, a king covered in dusted gold diving into a sacred lake. But as the tale passed through European ears, it became an empire. Expeditions followed fleets, armies, fortunes spent in pursuit of a city that shimmered forever out of reach. Men vanished into forests, driven mad by the gleam of their own desire. The land gave them fever instead of treasure, silence instead of glory. Yet the myth endured, because it was never truly about gold. El Dorado was about longing the dream that somewhere perfection gleamed just beyond endurance. And in the frozen north, cartographers marked a name whispered by explorers and mystics alike: Thule. The Greeks imagined it as the boundary between the known world and the realm of the gods, a place where sea met sky in endless twilight. Later, medieval scholars placed it at the top of every map, the crown of existence. To reach Thule was to touch the edge of reality itself. It was less a destination than an idea, the point where knowledge dissolves into wonder. The narrator's tone grows softer, almost tender. We never stopped looking for Thule, they say. We only changed its shape. Each era invents its own unreachable lands. The Enlightenment chased utopia. The Victorians dreamed of the poles. The modern world looks upward to Mars, to exoplanets, to digital heavens made of light. The names change, but the impulse remains. We are creatures of yearning. The map is only ever complete when there is still something missing. To draw an imaginary place is to confess hope. The medieval monks who inked monsters into their margins did not believe in their claws, they believed in mystery. The sailors who marked, "Here be dragons," were not warning others away, but declaring that wonder lived there. To imagine the unseen is to resist the finality of knowledge. It is to say, the story is not over. The narrator continues, voice calm and wistful. Every blank on an old map was a kind of mercy. It reminded us that certainty has a price. Because once the earth was measured, something vanished from it. When the last blank space was filled, humanity found itself surrounded by clarity and starved for astonishment. The age of discovery ended, but the hunger for discovery did not. And so we turned inward, mapping dreams, mapping atoms, mapping consciousness, each new frontier another echo of High Brazil's mist. The geography of wonder simply migrated from sea to soul. There is beauty in the persistence of the imaginary. Even when disproven, these places do not die. They live in art, in poetry, in the secret corners of belief. Some say High Brazil still appears in the shimmer of northern seas at dusk. Others claim that El Dorado was found not as a city, but as a reflection in the surface of a lake, showing the sky gilded with sunset. Perhaps every myth hides a truth, not of geography, but of longing. The camera drifts over waves and clouds. The world looks fragile, timeless, unfinished. The narrator speaks almost in a whisper. Perhaps the map was never meant to show where things are, but what we are missing. What we call fiction may be memory, and what we call myth may be prophecy. In ancient times, cartographers wrote the word terra incognita, unknown land, not as a confession of ignorance, but as an act of faith. It meant there was still something sacred left to find. Now, our maps no longer have room for such words, but in their absence, imagination endures. painting its own invisible geographies. Maybe that is the truest human instinct, to believe that beyond what we see, something more waits. The unreachable keeps us moving. The impossible keeps us awake. Even now, in a world encircled by satellites and algorithms, we still dream of hidden worlds, the lost city beneath the ice, the civilization beneath the sea, the version of Earth that might have been. The myths have simply changed medium. They live now in our screens, our science, our stories. The narrator's voice softens into a final meditation. Hi Brazil, El Dorado, Thule. They were never mistakes. They were mirrors. Each reflected what we most desired to find: peace, abundance, transcendence. When we stopped searching for them, we didn't stop believing. We only stopped admitting that we believed. The scene slows to silence. Waves glimmer under a violet sky. A faint island flickers on the horizon, not real, but luminous. It shimmers once, then dissolves. The camera does not chase it, because perhaps that is the lesson. The places that never were are not failures of knowledge, but triumphs of imagination. They remind us that mystery is not the opposite of truth. It is its continuation. When a map lies, it is not deceiving. It is dreaming. The narrator smiles softly, the tone like a sigh between waking and sleep. And so the map folds, and the dream remains. The screen fades to black. For a moment, there is nothing, only the sound of distant waves, as if the earth itself is breathing through its myths, holding on to its last blank spaces. The world is mapped. The mystery begins again. For the first time in history, humanity can trace nearly every river, every mountain, every star. Satellites orbit endlessly, mapping forests leaf by leaf, cities block by block, faces frame by frame. The seas have been sounded, the skies surveyed, the genome sequenced. We have charted even the unseen black holes, quantum shadows, the hidden folds of time. And yet, standing in the light of all this knowledge, something in us trembles. For when the map is complete, what remains to be found? The narrator's voice drifts slowly, almost weightless. We thought the end of the unknown would bring peace, but it only made the silence louder. Once, the blank spaces on the map were the borders of imagination, places where sea monsters and miracles still breathed. Now, the new maps shimmer behind glass, pulsing with data. The satellites see everything except wonder. Our instruments can measure gravity's curve, but not the pull of longing. They can chart neural pathways, but not the shape of a thought. The deeper we map, the more we uncover the unmappable, the infinite reflected inside the finite. The film lingers on the image of the Earth seen from orbit, flawless and complete. Every contour accounted for, every coastline defined. Yet in that perfection lies a strange unease. The blue planet, once an endless mystery, now appears fragile, a polished marble adrift in dark space. The closer we come to total knowledge, the more we sense its boundaries. Beyond the edge of precision, there is still shadow. The mystery did not vanish. It simply changed address. It moved inward. The narrator breathes softly, as if addressing the listener alone. Perhaps the final blank space is not on any map, but within the one holding it. Inside every mapped truth lives an unmapped question. The genome, once decoded, revealed not simplicity but symphonies of uncertainty, sequences that refuse to settle into meaning. The universe, once thought measurable, expands faster than we can define it. Even in our technology, limits whisper, algorithms that learn too much, patterns that no longer explain but predict, reflections that begin to outthink the observer. We have created tools that see farther than our understanding can follow. And still, we reach. Because reaching is what makes us human. The desire to know has never been about mastery. It is a form of faith. To explore is to believe that there is more than we can see. Each discovery, rather than closing the circle, draws it wider. The horizon retreats, patient, infinite, smiling at our persistence. The narrator continues, voice calm as night tide. The world may be mapped, but meaning never will be. We have mapped our bodies in pixels, our friendships in networks, our minds in scans. Yet the heart remains a wilderness. Science can trace the neuron's spark, but not the birth of love. Psychology can label emotion, but not the mystery of why it endures. Even as knowledge expands, we remain surrounded by the same quiet, the same blank that drew the first cartographer's hand thousands of years ago. And so, the circle closes. The age of maps began with ore clay tablets, inked constellations, whispers of divine geometry. It ends, for now, in code and light. But perhaps the difference is smaller than we think. Both are ways of saying the same thing. We are here, and we do not understand. Mapping is confession disguised as comprehension, a promise that if we draw enough lines, the infinite will behave. Yet the infinite never does. The narrator's tone deepens, reverent and reflective. Even now, at the height of our clarity, mystery is not gone, it has simply learned to hide where we rarely look. We live in an age without dragons, but with deeper fears. Extinction, isolation, digital ghosts. The monsters no longer live beyond the edge of the map. They live within the algorithms we build, the systems we no longer control. The void we once feared on the horizon has migrated into ourselves. The cosmos looks back, and in its vast reflection, we glimpse our own confusion. But perhaps that is not tragedy. Perhaps it is grace. For mystery, once lost, has returned not as danger, but as invitation. When we stare into data, when we drift through stars rendered on a screen, we rediscover the same old feeling that guided ancient sailors through fog. Wonder mixed with fear, fear softened by faith. The feeling that knowledge is not a wall but a window. The camera turns slowly, from galaxies to neurons to coastlines to digital grids, each image mirroring the other. Patterns repeat. Rivers branch like lightning, lungs like trees, synapses like constellations. The world folds into itself, and we realize it was never separate, only scaled. The same geometry, infinite in reflection. The narrator's voice, barely above a whisper. When everything has been mapped, only the mapmaker remains staring into the mirror he has drawn. There is a kind of peace in that, to know that the final frontier is not distant, but intimate, that the blank spaces we feared were not failures of knowledge, but invitations to humility. We are the explorers now, not of oceans or continents, but of consciousness, that inner landscape that resists every instrument except wonder. The sound of waves returns soft, unhurried. The film slows to the rhythm of breathing. The narrator's tone gentles into closure. The first maps were drawn to make the world less frightening. But now, we understand. The unknown was never the enemy. It was the heartbeat of existence. Every discovery, every revelation, every satellite image points us back toward the same truth that the world was never waiting to be found. It was waiting to be felt. And that feeling, the quiet awe of being here, of not knowing, is what keeps the stars alive in our minds. The image fades to a view of the Earth at night. Networks of light, glowing like veins, yet surrounded by endless dark. The lights pulse softly, like memory, like heartbeat. The narrator breathes the final words with calm certainty. Every ending redraws its beginning. The map folds, the lights dim. The Earth turns once more through darkness, perfectly known, endlessly mysterious. He wakes to light he cannot name. It shimmers not from flame or dawn, but from screens vast, weightless, endless. The air hums, the walls glow, and the old cartographer blinks, his ink-stained fingers trembling as if memory itself had conjured him forward in time. His parchment has become glass. His compass, code. The world, the same world he once chased across blank paper, now unfolds before him in perfect precision. Every mountain digitized, every ocean measured, every cloud recorded in motion. For a moment, he smiles. The dream of centuries has come true. The Earth is finally known. And yet, something feels wrong. He leans close to the glowing globe, the one that turns beneath satellites and algorithms. He zooms in past continents, past cities, past the streets that shimmer like veins of gold. He expects to feel satisfaction, but feels only silence. The map shows everything, yet gives nothing back. There are no edges anymore, no mysteries to trace, no monsters to name, only coordinates, only answers. The old hunger that trembling in the hand that once drew has nowhere left to go. The narrator speaks softly, as though recounting a dream half remembered. He had lived for truth, but truth without wonder is only a mirror. The cartographer wanders the modern world like a ghost of parchment and ink. He watches as people hold the earth in their palms, scrolling through countries with their thumbs, shrinking oceans to fit inside their hands. They no longer look at the world, they look through it. The old art of seeing has become the new habit of glancing. He visits a museum and finds his own maps framed behind glass. Once sacred, now quaint, their inaccuracies turned into charm, their mistakes into history. He stares at his own lines, his own faiths rendered obsolete. But in those lines, those uncertain, trembling lines, he feels something that no satellite can draw, longing. The trembling between knowing and not knowing. The human part of the map. The narration lingers in that emotion, slow and meditative. Perhaps it was never the world he was mapping, the voice whispers. Perhaps it was himself, his place within a mystery too large to name. He steps outside and looks upward. The night sky is the same as it ever was, though now, streaked with satellites. He remembers how he once drew the heavens by candlelight, connecting stars that might not even exist anymore. It occurs to him that every map, no matter how precise, is already a memory, the world as it once was, frozen in an act of faith. He kneels in the street, tracing a line on the ground with his finger, an old habit reborn in silence. Around him, the city glows like a constellation fallen to earth. He realizes that the streets themselves are maps not of geography, but of desire. Each light is a home, each path a story. The modern world, he understands, is mapped not by ink but by movement. We chart ourselves, by where we go, what we seek, who we remember. The narrator's tone softens, reverent. Every map, old or new, is a confession of hope. The cartographer closes his eyes. He sees High Brazil shimmering in the fog, El Dorado gleaming beneath the sun, Thule frozen at the edge of memory. He sees satellites tracing orbits like mechanical angels, cities pulsing with invisible signals, hearts glowing faintly on digital maps of connection. The centuries fold together, parchment and pixel, quill and code, all drawn by the same trembling hand of humanity, reaching out into the unknown. He understands then that nothing has changed. The tools are different, but the yearning is the same. Whether carved into clay or rendered in data, the map is still a prayer, a way to say we were here. It was never about the world. It was about belonging to it. The music swells softly, a single piano note sustained like breath. The narrator continues. Every age believes it has found the truth of the earth. But the map was never meant to end. It was meant to remind us that truth is not a place, it is a journey. The cartographer looks once more at the glowing globe spinning in the screen's light. It is beautiful, flawless, and utterly silent. With a slow hand, he reaches for his old quill, the one he has carried through centuries of dream. He dips it, not into ink, but into memory, and draws upon the glowing glass a single imperfect line. It wavers, uneven, alive, and for the first time the world feels human again. The narrator smiles through the words. Perfection has no heartbeat. Only mistakes can breathe. The old man sets down the quill. Around him, the air begins to shimmer the past, folding into the present, the parchment dissolving into light. The globe fades, and in its place remains a single shape, a circle, incomplete, glowing faintly like a sunrise half drawn. He whispers something, words that sound like prayer, or gratitude, or farewell. Then he vanishes, leaving behind only the faint scent of ink and the echo of a hand that once tried to capture eternity. The screen slowly fades to the sound of wind turning a page. The narrator speaks, barely audible now, the voice somewhere between history and dream. Maybe every map is a letter to the future. Maybe what we draw is not the world, but our wish to be remembered within it. A pause, stillness, and then the closing line, soft as sleep. The truest map is the one that leads us back to wonder. The music fades to silence. Only a faint scratching remains, the ghost of quill on paper, tracing one last horizon before dissolving completely. The narrator breathes, the words floating like a benediction over the dark. And thus ends The Map That Lied.